Welcome, mystery lovers, to another timeless tale of Father Brown. On a fog-drenched evening in Camden Hill, an inventor is found dead in his locked flat. No stranger was seen entering, no weapon was discovered, and yet the whispers begin, of an assassin who walked unseen, of a killer who could vanish into thin air. Neighbors speak in hushed voices of the invisible man. But while the police point to the obvious suspect, only one small, quiet priest knows the truth, that invisibility is not a trick of the eyes, but of the human heart. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I'd love to see our mystery family from around the world. And don't forget to share these stories with your fellow mystery enthusiasts, so we can keep these classic tales alive together. Now, grab a cup of tea, settle into a quiet corner, and prepare yourself, because tonight we uncover the chilling case of the Invisible Man. Chapter 1. A Death in the Fog. The fog lay heavy over Camden Hill that afternoon, as though the air itself were intent on keeping secrets. Lamps already glowed at the edges of the road, though it was only 3 o'clock, and their blurred halos gave the street a half-submerged look, like lanterns in a drowned city. Houses loomed behind iron gates and climbing ivy, their outlines softened until they seemed less like dwellings and more like shapes remembered in dreams. At the far end of the lane stood a modest block of flats, newer than the grand houses that surrounded it, and yet possessing its own peculiarity, an air of anonymity so complete that it almost looked like a place meant to be forgotten. Windows stood alike in rows, curtains drawn or twitching with half-concealed glances. Nothing about the building seemed to invite attention. It was here that Father Brown found himself walking, his squat figure muffled in a shabby overcoat, his hat dampened by the fog. To passers-by, he seemed the least remarkable figure in the street, though the way he paused at a doorway or turned his head suggested he saw more than he admitted. There was something in his patient, almost childlike face that belonged more to timeless truths than to any particular moment of the day. The place was unusually quiet, save for the clatter of a milk cart in the distance and the faint footfalls of a postman who moved with habitual speed along his round. The postman slipped through the fog, pausing at each gate to drop letters through a slot, a figure so ordinary as to be invisible in the very act of being seen. He neither looked to the left nor right, only marched with the certainty of a man who belonged to the rhythm of the street. Yet in the silence of that afternoon, an unease clung to the walls. Tenants peered from behind lace curtains, their movements furtive, their faces shadowed. The porter of the building, a tall fellow with a bristling moustache, stood outside smoking as though to convince himself that nothing unusual lurked within. His eyes darted now and then to the windows above, where a single room shone with unnatural brightness. Inside that room, the life of Isidore Smythe, a young man of invention and ambition, beat like a restless drum. Smythe was known in the neighborhood not for warmth or sociability, but for his ceaseless experiments with strange devices. His flat was filled with sketches, wires, and peculiar machines that seemed to hint at marvels or madness. Yet for all his eccentricities, he had recently become engaged to Laura Hope, a woman whose quiet beauty and steadfast spirit had attracted not only admiration but jealousy. Among those who carried unspoken envy was John Angus, a man of sharp temper and burning passion, who had once hoped to win Laura's hand. To see her betrothed to Smythe filled him with a bitterness that smoldered beneath every word he spoke. Neighbors whispered of arguments and threats, though such talk always grows like ivy around the walls of romance. The evening before, voices had been heard rising from Smythe's rooms, one sharp and furious, the other calm but unyielding. No one could swear to the words, but the tones alone suggested a quarrel of gravity. And so, as the fog deepened on that present day, rumor already lay thick upon the building, more suffocating than the mist outside. Father Brown did not enter at once. He lingered at the gate, listening not only with his ears but with that peculiar sensitivity of the soul that attends to the silences between sounds. He noticed the porter's stiff posture, the tremor in his hand as he drew upon his pipe, the way a curtain fluttered and fell still again. It was the hush of a place that knew of something terrible yet unspoken, like a parish waiting for the toll of the death bell. At last, a figure emerged from the doorway above. It was Angus, his face pale and tight with agitation, his coat hastily buttoned as though he had no patience for ceremony. He glanced about, saw Father Brown, and stiffened as though caught in an unwelcome thought. Then, with hurried steps, he vanished into the fog. The porter followed him with narrowed eyes, muttering beneath his moustache. It was only then that Father Brown approached the door. The porter greeted him with a mix of relief and suspicion, as if the presence of the clergyman might somehow sanctify the air but also threaten to reveal what should remain hidden. Inside the flat, light spilled unnaturally bright from a room where a curious stillness reigned. Smythe lay upon the floor, lifeless, his head struck in such a way that no accident could be imagined. Around him were scattered his inventions, a broken model, a half-written design, and a spatter of ink that seemed like the shadow of blood. The police had been called but not yet arrived. Those present muttered of a locked room, of no stranger seen entering or leaving. They spoke in whispers, as though the walls themselves might overhear. The windows were latched, the door unbroken, and the only people who had entered the building that day were familiar ones, tenants, servants, and the postman, who had made his round as usual. And yet, a man was dead. Murder had walked those stairs. Murder had come unseen, and gone unseen. The porter said it first, with a kind of dreadful relish that comes when common men brush the edge of legend, that it must have been an invisible man. Father Brown bent down, his stubby hands folded over his umbrella, his round face grave but not surprised. He said nothing yet, for he was listening still, not to the voices around him, but to the silence beneath them. The fog pressed against the window panes like a living thing. The room seemed to hold its breath. And thus began the mystery of the invisible man. Chapter 2. Camden Hill in Shadow. In the days that followed the discovery of Isidore Smythe's body, the fog lifted from Camden Hill, but the pall of mystery remained as though it had settled into the very brickwork of the building. The air no longer smelled only of smoke and damp, but of whispers that seemed to linger in the stairwell and hover near the door of every flat. The porter, whose moustache quivered whenever he spoke of the event, declared with an almost triumphant gloom that he had seen no stranger come or go. Yet if there had been no stranger, then the shadow of suspicion must fall upon those most familiar. And so the tenants found themselves drawn, one by one, into the slow, searching gaze of Father Brown. He asked few questions, and when he did, they seemed almost childlike in their simplicity. But his eyes, mild and absent-seeming, were not the eyes of a man gathering gossip. They were the eyes of a priest who listened not to answers, but to the tremor of the human soul behind them. The first figure of importance was Laura Hope, the fiancée of the dead man. She was spoken of in the neighborhood as a woman of rare composure, and when Father Brown saw her, he thought of a flame sheltered beneath glass, steady, unwavering, but fragile in its own way. She received him in a drawing-room that seemed curiously untouched by grief, as though she had arranged every cushion and polished every ornament to maintain order against chaos. Her voice, low and measured, carried the tones of one who had schooled herself to accept tragedy without display. Yet her hands betrayed her, for they moved with nervous precision, folding and unfolding a handkerchief as though to occupy the restless grief within. Laura admitted that her fiancé had been eccentric, often absorbed in his inventions to the exclusion of all else. Yet she spoke of him with loyalty, defending his genius and gentleness against the murmurs of neighbors who thought him cold. When asked if Smythe had enemies, She allowed that his engagement to her had not pleased all parties. Her eyes flickered, just for a moment, at the name of John Angus. Angus himself was of a very different sort. Where Smythe had been pale and preoccupied, Angus was a man of fire, tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that blazed even in silence. He was known for his temper, and though he carried himself with a kind of proud restraint, it was plain that restraint cost him dearly. When Father Brown encountered him at a corner table in a nearby inn, Angus's glass of brandy trembled as he set it down, betraying the storm beneath his outward calm. He spoke of Laura with passion, of Smythe with bitterness, and of the whole affair with a kind of restless anger that turned against himself as much as others. He insisted upon his innocence, though Father Brown had not accused him. His words poured out in sharp bursts, like sparks struck from stone, yet beneath them lay something that puzzled the priest more than rage. A sense of despair, as though Angus feared not only accusation but the collapse of meaning itself. Other figures emerged in the background, each casting faint shadows across the story. There was the porter, whose gruff exterior concealed an eagerness to be thought important, a man who clung to his account of events as though it gave him stature in the eyes of the police. There were tenants who claimed to have heard footsteps but could not say whose, and one who had sworn he heard the slam of a door when none had been opened. Such fragments swirled like smoke, and the more they were grasped at, the more they dissolved. Yet one figure moved through the scene with a strange and unquestioned familiarity: the postman. No one thought to describe him at first, for he was too ordinary to notice. He had been seen as he always was, trudging through the fog with his satchel and his letters, his cap pulled low, his pace brisk but unhurried. He had passed the porter, the tenants, perhaps even Angus himself. Yet his presence stirred no remark. He was as invisible as the ticking of a clock in a quiet room. Father Brown took note of this invisibility, though he said nothing. He observed how people spoke of the postman, or rather, how they did not. They mentioned him only in passing, as one might mention the weather, and with as little reflection. Yet the priest, whose wisdom lay not in grand theories but in the observation of the small and the obvious, seemed to file this away in the cluttered cupboards of his mind where small truths often waited until they were needed. Beyond these, there hovered the figure of the police inspector, a competent man, eager to make a decisive arrest. His gaze lingered on Angus, whose passion and jealousy seemed to furnish motive enough. The inspector collected scraps of testimony, built them into something that looked like certainty, and prepared his case with the satisfaction of a craftsman. Yet Father Brown, watching quietly, noted how the man's conclusions leaned upon human drama rather than upon the peculiar silence that hung about the true criminal. Thus the cast of the tale assembled, each with their own voice and shadow. Laura, the flame within glass; Angus, the man of fire and despair; the porter, puffed with importance; the tenants, murmuring fragments; the inspector, shaping his theory; and the postman, seen by all, noticed by none. Father Brown himself remained as he always was, a small, shabby priest who seemed out of place in the play of passions and suspicions. Yet behind his round face and blinking eyes, a slow and certain thought was forming, not from the complexity of evidence, but from the simplicity of what had been overlooked. For in mysteries of the soul, the most obvious truths are often the most invisible. Chapter 3: Faces in the Half-Light. The murder of Isidore Smythe might have been expected to draw the neighborhood together in solemn sympathy, yet it seemed instead to divide them into camps of unease, each whispering to itself and wary of the other. The flats on Camden Hill became a hive of conjecture, with corridors echoing not with footsteps but with speculation. One tenant, a thin woman who lived on the second floor, declared that she could no longer sleep at night for fear of strange movements in the stairwell. Another swore that the building had acquired an echo, a phantom tread that followed behind the living. The porter, who now carried himself with the air of a man central to history, repeated his tale a dozen times to as many listeners, that no unfamiliar figure had entered on the day of the crime. His moustache bristled with self-importance as he declared that he knew every tenant, every servant, every errand boy. No stranger had crossed the threshold, and thus the killer must have been invisible. He said the word as though savoring it, like a child frightening himself with a ghost story. The rumor spread quickly, for people are eager to believe what is extraordinary when the ordinary is unbearable. In pubs and parlors, Camden Hill began to speak of the invisible man of Camden Hill. Some laughed, but their laughter was thin. Most spoke with lowered voices, glancing over their shoulders, as though even naming the thing might summon it. Yet unease took subtler forms as well. Laura Hope found herself the subject of cold glances in the street, as though others wondered at the mystery of her engagement and what secrets it might conceal. Neighbors hinted that Smythe's inventions had meddled with forces better left untouched. Electricity, magnets, things unseen yet powerful. It was said that he had once spoken of building a machine to make a man vanish from sight. Thus, in the peculiar arithmetic of gossip, his death was transmuted into the revenge of his own invention. John Angus, meanwhile, became a storm in human form. He walked the streets with a restless stride, his eyes flashing at anyone who dared look too long. Men muttered in his wake that his passion had turned murderous, while women whispered that no innocent man could rage so furiously. At the inn where he drank, customers edged their chairs away, yet listened eagerly for the violent words that spilled unguarded from his lips. The inspector, noting all this, grew quietly confident of his case. Yet there were smaller things, too, that disturbed the peace. Letters went missing from their slots in the lobby. A tenant claimed that her parcels had been tampered with. Another swore she had seen a figure in uniform climbing the stairs at dusk, though none could say whose door he had approached. These were small matters, easily explained, and yet they coiled into the larger fear like threads into a rope. Father Brown moved quietly through this atmosphere, his round face untroubled, his eyes attentive. He did not scorn the rumors of invisible men, nor did he encourage them. He listened as the porter boasted, as tenants speculated, as Laura wept without tears, and as Angus thundered his innocence to anyone who would hear. He nodded, blinked, and shuffled along, as though gathering nothing more than impressions. Yet to the few who noticed him closely, there was a peculiar weight in his silences, as though he heard beneath every word the unspoken heart of the matter. One evening, as he lingered in the stairwell, Father Brown overheard two tenants in hurried conversation. They spoke of the postman, remarking that he had been there on the day of the crime. But their voices carried a strange indifference, as though the postman's presence mattered no more than the ticking of the hall clock. When the priest turned the thought over in his mind, it struck him that here lay the heart of the unease. Not that a man might vanish into thin air, but that a man might walk openly among them and remain unseen. The police, however, pressed their case against Angus with mounting certainty. His quarrel with Smythe, his passion for Laura, his violent temper, all these made for a neat and satisfying picture. The inspector declared that the absence of any stranger only proved that the crime had sprung from within the circle of acquaintance. Angus, in his fury, fit the pattern like a glove. But Father Brown, standing quietly by the door of Smythe's flat, did not look at patterns. He looked at the scattered tools, at the smudges of ink, at the ordinary signs of a life interrupted. He thought of Smythe's work not as evidence of supernatural forces, but as the clutter of a man too absorbed in his own ideas to notice the world moving about him. He thought of Laura, sheltering her grief behind composure, of Angus, trapped by his own fire, of the porter, puffed with importance, and of the postman, that figure so utterly familiar that he had become invisible by the very fact of being seen daily. The unease of the building grew, But it was not the unease of the supernatural. It was the unease of souls brushing against truth and recoiling from it. For what men fear most is not the ghostly, but the ordinary truth that hides in plain sight. And Father Brown, listening in silence, knew that the invisible man was not a phantom at all, but a man whom everyone saw and no one noticed. Chapter 4: Whispers and Shadows. The day of the murder had already passed into the language of legend among the tenants of Camden Hill, though it had occurred scarcely a week before. Each resident told the tale with the assurance of one who had witnessed it all, though in truth none had seen more than fragments. A door closing, a step upon the stair, a murmur behind a wall. Yet from these fragments, the shape of the crime loomed larger and more terrible with every telling. The bare facts, stripped of rumor, were simple enough. Isidore Smythe had been found dead upon the floor of his flat. The weapon was never recovered, though the wound upon his skull suggested a blow from something blunt and heavy. The windows were latched from within. The door showed no sign of forced entry. No one had heard a struggle, save for vague noises that could be explained by the clatter of his experiments. And yet, the man was dead, murdered beyond doubt. The porter was first to give his account, and he gave it with the solemnity of a witness in Scripture. He swore he had seen Angus enter the building that afternoon, his face clouded with anger, his steps swift. He had heard voices raised in Smythe's rooms, one calm, one furious. Then silence. Soon after, Angus had descended, pale and trembling, and vanished into the fog. The porter insisted that in all the hours between, no stranger had entered or left. Tenants corroborated what they could. A seamstress on the floor below said she had heard the thump of something falling, but had thought it no more than the crash of one of Smythe's contraptions. Another resident recalled hearing a voice, though she could not swear whose. A third remembered the postman climbing the stairs earlier that day, but dismissed him at once, for the man came daily and never lingered. When the police arrived, they found the room in disarray. Papers were scattered, a half-finished drawing smeared with ink. A brass instrument lay bent and broken upon the floor, though whether it had been shattered in the struggle or in Smythe's restless work, no one could say. On the desk lay a letter, unfinished, as though the pen had been snatched from Smythe's hand at the very moment he set down his thoughts. The inspector, a brisk and practical man, lost little time in forming his conclusion. Smythe had been engaged to Laura Hope. Angus had loved her with consuming passion. A quarrel had ensued, heard by several witnesses. Angus had left in agitation. Smythe was found dead moments later. To the inspector, the matter was as clear as daylight. He ordered Angus taken in for questioning, his notes already forming the skeleton of a case that would satisfy both the courts and the newspapers. Laura, when she heard, did not faint or cry aloud. She sat as though carved from marble, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her composure was more terrible than grief, for it suggested that she had already rehearsed this moment in the secret chambers of her heart. When Father Brown saw her thus, he thought not of coldness, but of the dreadful discipline of a woman determined not to let the world see her break. Angus himself was a storm. When the inspector accused him, his denial rang through the room with such force that even the porter flinched. He swore he had quarreled, yes, but had left Smythe alive. He swore he had walked into the fog with nothing but his own rage for company. His words were fierce, but in them was the ring of desperation rather than guilt. Yet desperation is enough, sometimes, to condemn a man in the eyes of others. The mystery of the invisible man grew from this soil. For if Angus was not guilty, then who was? The door had admitted no stranger, the porter was certain of it. The tenants had seen no one unfamiliar. The postman had been there, yes, but who thinks of a postman as a visitor? And so the thought rose, whispered first in jest and then in earnest, that the killer had been invisible. It was said with half a laugh, yet the laugh was thin, and when the words settled, they were not easily dismissed. Some began to speculate that Smythe's experiments had indeed touched upon the supernatural. Had he made an enemy of powers unseen? Had he conjured his own destruction with the very devices that littered his room? Others muttered of ghosts, of retribution, of divine punishment. The hammer of God, they said, had fallen. Yet Father Brown, small and shabby in his corner, said nothing of the kind. He listened as others spoke, his head bowed as if in prayer. He looked at the scattered papers, at the unfinished letter, at the ink spilled like blood upon the desk. He looked at the porter, swollen with importance, at Laura, still as stone, at Angus, raging like a trapped lion. And he looked, most of all, at the absence of remark about the one man who had been seen but not seen, the man who came daily, whose presence was so ordinary as to vanish from notice. The crime itself was grim, but it was the silence around it that disturbed Father Brown most. For in silence, he knew, lie the loudest truths. Chapter 5. The Net Around Angus. The days that followed the crime drew the net of suspicion ever more tightly about John Angus. It was as though the fog that had once cloaked Camden Hill had lifted only to reveal him in merciless clarity. The inspector, with his tidy notes and brisk deductions, presented a case that seemed unanswerable. The neighbors repeated it in their whispers until it hardened into fact. Even those who pitied Angus admitted that pity was all they could offer, for the evidence, such as it was, pointed squarely at him. The quarrel between Angus and Smythe was no secret. More than one tenant had overheard the sharp tones, the clash of temper and cold resolve. The porter swore he had seen Angus enter the building, and then leave again, shaken and pale. The timeline was damning. Minutes after Angus departed, Smythe was found lifeless on the floor. To any reasonable mind, it seemed no puzzle at all. Angus did himself no favors. His denials were fierce, but his very fierceness worked against him. He shouted his innocence in taverns, struck his fist upon tables, raged at the unfairness of suspicion. People, who already believed him guilty, saw in this not the protest of a wronged man, but the outburst of a murderer cornered. Only the guilty raged so violently, muttered the inspector with a satisfied nod. It was a neat, circular judgment that needed no further proof. Laura Hope bore it all with her strange composure. She visited Angus once at the station where he was held for questioning. Those who saw them together remarked on the stillness of her face against the storm of his. She did not weep, nor did she accuse. She listened while he declared his innocence with blazing eyes, and when she left, she gave no sign of what she believed. This silence unsettled the neighborhood more than tears would have done. People wondered if her calmness was faith in Angus or doubt too deep for words. The porter, meanwhile, grew almost insufferable in his authority. He repeated his testimony with relish, telling anyone who would listen that he knew every face that crossed the threshold of the flats. Not a stranger entered, he declared again and again, as if the phrase itself were a talisman. His pride in his vigilance blinded him to the irony that a man might pass before his very eyes every day and be forgotten the moment he was gone. But no one thought to question him on this point, for his certainty was the anchor to which the inspector had tied his case. The tenants, too, played their part. Some remembered details with suspicious clarity. The sound of raised voices, the slam of a door, the creak of the stair. Others confessed to doubts but were swiftly corrected by their neighbors. The collective imagination turned conjecture into testimony, and testimony into fact. Soon, everyone believed they had always known Angus was the sort of man to kill in passion. It was less the strength of evidence than the strength of story that condemned him. Through all this, Father Brown wandered like a shadow in the background. He asked no accusatory questions, He offered no defense of Angus, yet his presence seemed to trouble the inspector. There was something in the priest's quiet blinking, in his habit of nodding to himself as if hearing a secret tune, that unsettled the tidy structure of official suspicion. The inspector pressed him once. Did he not see the case as clear? And Father Brown, with his disarming simplicity, replied that he saw many things clearly, so clearly that sometimes he could not see the larger picture at all. To Angus, Father Brown's silence was both torment and comfort. When he raged, the priest listened without judgment. When he demanded to know whether the church believed him guilty, Father Brown only said that the church had seen men guilty who did not rage, and innocent men who did. It was not a declaration of innocence, but it was enough to keep a flicker of hope alive in Angus's furious heart. Yet outside, the legend of the invisible man continued to grow. The idea that the killer had been unseen delighted the public imagination. Newspapers toyed with it, half mocking, half enthralled. Some suggested Smythe's inventions had turned against him. Others spoke of spirits, of divine wrath, of forces too terrible to be grasped. But beneath all the fancy, one fact remained. The only visible suspect was Angus. And so, by a grim irony, the man most visible became the one most condemned, while the truly invisible figure remained unseen. Father Brown, however, lingered often in the lobby, watching the comings and goings of the building. He noted how people glanced at one another, how they lowered their voices when the postman came briskly through. He observed the porter puff out his chest whenever Angus's name was mentioned. He noticed Laura's pale stillness, Angus's fiery despair. He observed everything, not as evidence, but as the outward shape of inward truths. For Father Brown knew what others did not, that human beings make themselves invisible not by vanishing into thin air, but by being so common, so ordinary, that they vanish into habit. And somewhere in that habit, he felt, lay the shadow that had struck down Isidore Smythe. Chapter 6. Father Brown Watches. The investigation proceeded with the slow inevitability of a tide, washing again and again over the same stones, each time smoothing them into a shape more pleasing to the inspector's design. Witnesses were interviewed, statements written, testimonies repeated until they sounded rehearsed. Yet though the process seemed thorough, it was like a play performed for an audience that already knew the ending. Every detail was bent toward the conviction of John Angus. The inspector, satisfied with his neat arrangement of facts, announced that the case was all but concluded. Smythe had been quarreling with Angus, the porter had seen him enter and leave, the timeline matched, and the motive was clear. It was, he declared, a case of passion and jealousy, nothing more. Father Brown, standing beside him as he closed his notebook, only murmured that nothing is ever nothing more. The inspector frowned, impatient with paradoxes. To him, the business of detection was the business of trimming away excess, of stripping a mystery down to its simplest explanation. To Father Brown, mysteries grew not from excess but from what was missing, from the little absences that others ignored. And so, while the inspector prepared his case, Father Brown began his own kind of investigation, one without official sanction, without written notes, and without the sharpness of accusation. His method was one of listening, not only to words, but to the silences between them. He spoke again with Laura Hope. She told her story calmly, almost mechanically, as if reciting lines she had learned by heart. Smythe had been nervous in the days before his death, more distracted than usual. He had muttered of difficulties with his inventions, and once, half joking, had spoken of enemies who might wish him harm. When asked to name them, Laura hesitated. She spoke of Angus, of course, but her voice faltered when she mentioned others, vague shadows of men who might have resented Smythe's sharp tongue or eccentric ways. Father Brown noted not what she said, but the way she left things unsaid, as if she feared her words might be twisted against her. From Angus he learned little new, save the depth of his despair. The man's innocence was proclaimed with a fire that consumed itself, leaving him haggard and hollow. He insisted that he had left Smythe alive, that his quarrel had been bitter but not fatal. Father Brown listened without judgment, for he knew that innocence, like guilt, often shouts too loudly. It was from the porter, oddly enough, that the priest gleaned the most. The man repeated his tale for the dozenth time, swelling with importance as he declared that no stranger had entered. Yet as he spoke, Father Brown watched the twitch of his moustache, the pride in his voice, the satisfaction he drew from being the central witness. It was pride, not precision, that shaped his memory. He had not observed so much as declared, not watched so much as assumed. The very certainty of his testimony was its weakness. The tenants offered little but confusion. One remembered hearing footsteps at a time when another swore the stair was silent. One claimed the postman had lingered longer than usual, though she admitted she had paid him no special attention. Another could not recall whether she had seen him at all. Father Brown noted these contradictions, not to accuse, but to remind himself that memory is a treacherous servant. Yet it was the postman himself who fascinated him most. Father Brown began to observe the man as he made his daily rounds. He was an ordinary figure, uniformed, brisk, efficient. He passed from door to door with practiced speed, pausing only to thrust letters through slots or collect signatures. People looked past him as one looks past a piece of furniture. He might have walked into a room full of strangers and left without a soul being able to describe the shape of his nose or the sound of his voice. One afternoon, Father Brown stood in the lobby as the postman entered. The man nodded briefly, delivered his letters, and departed. The tenants, passing him on the stairs, scarcely glanced his way. And in that moment, Father Brown felt the truth stir in his mind like a bird taking flight. For the invisible man was not a ghost, nor a phantom conjured by Smythe's machines. He was invisible because he was ordinary. Invisible because no one looked. Invisible because he had been seen too often to be seen at all. But the priest said nothing. Not yet. He knew that a truth spoken too soon can be as useless as a lie. Instead, he waited, gathering in silence, letting the unease of the house grow until it would be ready for revelation. The inspector, meanwhile, prepared his warrant against Angus, confident that the case was sealed. But Father Brown, small and shabby in the corner, knew that the true criminal still walked the streets of Camden Hill, seen every day and never seen at all. Chapter 7. A Prayer for the Dead. The storm of suspicion gathered thickly around Angus, and the inspector prepared to deliver the final stroke. Yet Father Brown, wandering quietly about the building with his umbrella under his arm, was thinking of a different storm altogether, one that broke not with thunder, but with silence. 4 days he had watched the rhythms of the house, the porter bustling with exaggerated vigilance, the tenants whispering their theories, the inspector moving like a man rehearsing for a triumph. And always, in the background, the postman, slipping in and out like a shadow at noon. He was greeted with nods but no attention, remembered only by the letters he carried. To every eye he was a piece of furniture in motion, present, yet unseen. Father Brown knew that to expose such a man required not accusation, but invitation. He needed to create a space where the invisible would be forced into visibility, where habit would betray itself, and where ordinariness would become extraordinary by the mere act of being noticed. Thus he set about his quiet trap. It was nothing so dramatic as the inspector might have imagined, no elaborate ruse or staged drama. Instead, Father Brown requested that all the tenants of the flats gather in the lobby on a particular afternoon, under the pretense of a memorial prayer for the departed Smythe. He explained that it was fitting for the neighbors to pay their respects together, and even the inspector, though impatient with the interruption, agreed to attend. The gathering was unremarkable to outward eyes. Tenants stood awkwardly in the lobby, murmuring half-embarrassed condolences. The porter hovered proudly, as though he were master of ceremonies. Laura Hope stood apart, pale and still, her eyes fixed on the worn carpet. Angus was not present. The inspector had forbidden it, lest he disturb the order of things. And then, as always, the postman arrived. He pushed through the door with his familiar bag, gave a brisk nod, and began his rounds. His presence, so ordinary, seemed almost a desecration of the solemn moment, yet no one remarked upon it. No one, that is, except Father Brown. The priest stepped forward, gently intercepting the man. With a mild word, he asked him to pause and join the gathering, for even the bearer of letters might share in the prayer for a departed soul. The postman looked startled, almost offended, but under the gaze of so many neighbors, he could not refuse. He set down his bag and stood among them, stiff and uncomfortable. It was then that Father Brown began to speak. His words were not the thunder of accusation, but the soft cadences of reflection. He spoke of how men are often overlooked, how the most ordinary lives pass unnoticed, how even a friend or neighbor can become invisible through habit. He spoke of how sins, too, hide best in plain sight, under the cover of what is most familiar. His voice was low, but it carried in the stillness of the lobby, and one by one, the faces of the tenants turned not to Angus, not to each other, but to the solitary figure of the postman standing in their midst. The man shifted uneasily. His eyes darted toward the door. His hands twitched as though longing to seize the bag at his feet. And in that moment, without a word of evidence, without a single accusation, the room understood what Father Brown had seen from the first, that the invisible man was visible at last. The inspector, catching the look, moved swiftly, placing a firm hand upon the man's shoulder. Resistance flared for an instant, but it was too late. The cloak of ordinariness had been stripped away, and the postman's invisibility was broken. Father Brown, folding his hands, lowered his head in prayer. He had not trapped the man with force, nor with cunning, but with the simple act of noticing what others had ignored. In a world where men looked past one another, he had looked directly, and that had been enough. Chapter 8. The Unmasking of the Ordinary. When the inspector's hand fell heavy on the postman's shoulder, a murmur ran through the gathered tenants like the rustle of wind in dry leaves. For a moment the man stiffened, as though he might break free and bolt into the fog outside. But his eyes, darting from face to face, found only recognition, the recognition of guilt long unseen, now suddenly illuminated. His knees seemed to weaken, and with a half-suppressed groan, he slumped into the chair that had been set aside for Laura Hope. The inspector demanded answers, his voice sharp, eager, almost triumphant. But Father Brown raised a hand, asking with soft authority that the man be given a moment. It was not for the inspector's satisfaction that the truth must be told, but for the souls of all present, for the bewildered tenants, for the grieving Laura, and even for the broken Angus, waiting elsewhere under the shadow of false accusation. In the hush that followed, Father Brown began to speak. His words were not hurried, nor were they dramatic. They came with the unhurried weight of inevitability, as though they had been present all along, waiting only for the fog of illusion to lift. He explained that the true wonder of the crime lay not in invisibility of the supernatural kind, but in the invisibility born of habit. The postman was seen by every tenant, every day, yet not one could describe him with any clarity. He was the very emblem of the unnoticed, a man so familiar that he was forgotten the instant he was gone. The porter, in his pride, had declared that no stranger entered the building. And he had been right. No stranger did. The killer was not a stranger at all, but the most familiar figure of them all, the man with the letters. His boast, meant to prove his vigilance, had in fact concealed the truth, that the danger lay not in the unrecognized, but in the overlooked. Father Brown turned his round, mild gaze upon the tenants. He reminded them how each of them, questioned separately, had faltered when recalling whether they had seen the postman at all. Some had sworn they had not. Others had said they could not remember. Yet the letters had arrived on their tables. The signatures in his ledger bore their names. He had been there, but he had not been noticed. He was invisible not because he could not be seen, but because no one had looked. As for motive, the truth was as common as the man himself. Smythe, it seemed, had threatened the postman with exposure. The eccentric inventor, in his careless arrogance, had stumbled upon some petty fraud, a theft of correspondence, perhaps, or a misuse of the parcels entrusted to him. Smythe had confronted him, and the quarrel that followed ended in violence. The postman, ordinary and unseen, had seized the chance to silence a troublesome tongue, certain that no one would ever think to suspect him. The inspector shifted uneasily, for the reasoning was plain, and yet it was he who had been ready to condemn Angus. The tenants looked at one another with faces pale from the recognition of their blindness. Laura Hope raised her eyes at last, not to the priest, not to the inspector, but to Angus's absence, her lips moving in a silent prayer of thanks. The postman, when pressed, muttered a few broken words of denial. But the words were hollow, falling flat in the heavy air of the lobby. He knew, as they all knew, that his cloak of invisibility had been torn away. His ordinariness, once his shield, now marked him as the only possible culprit. Father Brown, seeing the man's despair, did not look on him with triumph. Instead, he lowered his head gently, as if in sorrow. For to him, guilt was not a spectacle but a sickness. One more soul fallen into shadow, one more man who had hidden his sin in plain sight. And so the mystery of the invisible man was revealed, that the murderer was never unseen at all, but merely ignored by eyes too accustomed to pass him by. The extraordinary trick had been nothing but the ordinary truth, and it was Father Brown's gift to see it. Chapter 9. Seeing the ordinary truly. When the postman was led away, the murmur of the tenants lingered in the air like the aftertaste of smoke. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes avoiding one another, as though each feared to find reflected there the blindness that had so long shielded the truth. The inspector busied himself with his papers, his sharp confidence dimmed by the realization that his net, so neatly tied, had been cast in the wrong sea. Only Father Brown seemed at ease. He sat quietly in a wooden chair by the door, his round face lowered, his fingers interlaced upon his lap. To him, the revelation was not a triumph to be savored, but a sorrow to be pondered. And when at last the murmur stilled, he raised his head and spoke with the gentle gravity of one addressing not the ears, but the conscience. He told them that the world is full of invisible men. They are not made so by magic, nor by the tricks of invention, but by the ordinary blindness of human eyes. The milkman, the cabman, the charwoman, the postman, those who serve without demanding notice, pass through our lives unseen. We look past them because they are familiar, and familiarity breeds forgetfulness. It is in this very forgetfulness that danger hides, for sins, like men, thrive best when no one looks at them. He reminded them that it was pride that had blinded the porter, who boasted that no stranger entered his building. Pride had blinded the inspector, eager for a clean solution. Pride, too, had blinded the tenants, who preferred gossip and rumor to the patient work of understanding. They had all been content to see what they expected, and so they had failed to see what was before their eyes. Sin, Father Brown said softly, does not usually wear a mask of horror. It hides in the ordinary, the everyday, the little lies and petty crimes that seem too small to notice. Yet it is these little things that grow into the great wrongs of the world. Evil often chooses the plainest cloak, the cloak of habit. That is why the saints tell us to look with fresh eyes at what we think we know. For the devil is never so dangerous as when he looks like the most ordinary of men. Laura Hope, who had listened in silence, seemed to draw closer to his words. She understood, perhaps more than the others, what it was to be unseen, for in Smythe's shadow, in Angus's passion, she had often been overlooked herself. Yet in this moment, she felt that invisibility had been lifted, and her eyes filled with tears she did not let fall. The inspector muttered something about official reports, but his voice lacked its earlier crispness. For he, too, had felt the sting of Father Brown's reflection. It was not merely that he had been wrong. It was that he had been wrong in the very way all men are wrong, by overlooking the obvious because it seemed too ordinary. Father Brown rose slowly, his movements unhurried, as though the weight of the truth were heavier than his small frame. He did not gloat, nor did he lecture. He only left them with a final thought, that justice, like grace, is found not by searching the extraordinary, but by seeing truly the ordinary. And perhaps, he added, if men learned to look more carefully at their neighbors, fewer invisible men would walk the earth. The room was still as he took up his umbrella and prepared to leave. Those who had gathered for a memorial found themselves instead attending a lesson not only about crime, but about sight, about pride, and about the peril of blindness in the midst of daylight. And so the moral of the invisible man was left with them, that the greatest mysteries are not solved by cleverness, but by humility, not by looking harder at the shadows, but by opening one's eyes to the light. Chapter 10. Calm after the fog. The following morning dawned pale and cold over Camden Hill, the fog lifting in tatters that revealed rooftops wet with dew. The streets, so recently filled with rumor and agitation, seemed strangely subdued, as if the neighborhood itself were weary from its fever of suspicion. John Angus was released from his confinement. He emerged haggard, his face drawn with sleepless nights, but his eyes burned with a light both fierce and relieved. Those who had whispered against him now avoided his gaze, ashamed to have built their certainties upon the frail scaffolding of gossip. Angus himself said little. His gratitude was expressed not in words but in the firm grip of his hand when he met Father Brown outside the station. Laura Hope waited for him there, pale but steadfast, and together they walked slowly up the hill toward the flats. Their figures, side by side yet silent, had the look not of triumph but of survival. Two souls carrying a burden together, though the weight had shifted from accusation to endurance. The neighbors watched from their windows, chastened, some with curiosity, others with a shame that dared not show itself in words. The inspector, meanwhile, busied himself with the practical business of law. His official report would smooth the awkwardness of his error with tidy phrases. He was not an unkind man, only a practical one, and he preferred to forget the priest's paradoxes in favor of neat conclusions. Yet deep down, a small doubt lingered, an unease that would return when he next faced a case too obvious to question. As for the porter, his pride was punctured, though not destroyed. He still repeated his tale of vigilance, but now with less certainty, more hesitance. For once, he had been forced to realize that what he did not see might matter more than what he did. It was a lesson he carried like a stone in his shoe, small, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the streets in a dim golden haze, Father Brown took his leave. He walked alone, his short figure ambling along the narrow pavement, his umbrella tucked beneath his arm. The air was clearer now, the fog dispersed, but he did not look about him as though seeking beauty. Instead, his gaze was inward, his expression thoughtful and mild. A neighbor, emboldened by gratitude, asked him how he had solved the mystery when all others were blind. Father Brown only smiled faintly and said that men miss the truth not because it is hidden, but because it is plain. The world, he added softly, is full of invisible men. Only, they are invisible because we choose not to see them. With that, he raised his hat in farewell and continued down the quiet street, vanishing not into fog, but into the unnoticed ordinary of life, where, like the invisible men he spoke of, he would walk until called again by mystery and human weakness. And so Camden Hill returned to its weary peace. The flats settled into silence, the quarrels and whispers fading into memory. Yet for those who had been present, the figure of the little priest remained as unforgettable as the crime itself. For Father Brown had shown them that evil does not always wear a mask, and that the most dangerous invisibility is the blindness of the human heart.